Welcome back to another Kingdom talk. This time we're talking about Kingdom Protista. Kingdom Protista is made up of a group of creatures called Protists. So let's go ahead and get into this and see what we can find. So there are some really good brain pops that you can watch. You can watch brain pops about Protista. You can also watch brain pops about some of the specific groups like the protozoa and the algae. So a protist is a eukaryotic organism, and I'm going to sing for you again. A cell with a nucleus is a eukaryote. Okay, so it's got a nucleus, it's got other membrane-bound organelles, and members of the kingdom protist can be either animal-like, plant-like, or fungus-like. So they're not animals, they're not plants, they're not fungus, but they're like those things. So here are some of the main characteristics of protists. First of all, they are either single-celled eukaryotes, cell with a nucleus is a eukaryote, or many-celled prokaryotes, and one without one is a prokaryote. So if they have many-celled, they don't have a nucleus. If they are single-celled, they do have a nucleus. Some produce their food, make their food, photosynthesis. Some consume, eat their food like we do. They can reproduce either by fission or conjugation, just like bacteria. Fission is basically one cell splitting into two cells, and conjugation is a way where cells join together and exchange genetic material, DNA, chromosomes, and then they each divide separately. Three main groups of protists, right in the definition. There are the algae, which are the plant-like protists. There are the protozoa, which are the animal-like protists. And there are the fungus-like protists, which don't have a special name like algae or protozoa. So we're going to go ahead and look at these three groups. The first one are the algae. They have a few characteristics that make them plant-like. They photosynthesize. They're stationary, just like plants. They don't move. And they're either single-celled or they're simple-celled. So 6 main groups. There's the diatoms, the ones that you find in your toothpaste and other polishes and cleaners. So if you brushed your teeth today, you may have had diatoms in your mouth. They have 2-part shells. The dinoflagellates, and if you hear the beginning of their word dino means terrible. They're the terrible flagellates. They have 2 flagella. And they cause something called the red tide. If you've ever been at the ocean and wanted to have a good seafood dinner, and you got someplace and they said, sorry, we're not serving seafood because of the red tide. It's a bunch of these that get in there. It causes the ocean to actually turn red. But they're made of poisons and toxins, and so when the fish and the shellfish eat them, they can cause problems then and pass down the food chain to even us. The euglena, one of my favorite, euglena can eat their food, but they can also make their food. So they're in the plant-like group because they can photosynthesize. But on the other hand, they can also eat their food when there's not enough sun, or let's say they're in a pond and a big sycamore leaf falls on top of them. And so during the month while they're swimming out from under it, they can eat, and they do eat. They also have a flagella that's next to their eye spot, and their eye spot can detect light. And so their flagella then moves them towards the light. Then we have the colored algae, the green algae, the brown algae, and the red algae. The green algae make probably up to 50% of the oxygen that we breathe on the earth. A lot of green algae are many-celled, and you can actually see them. In fact, if green algae had a nucleus, they'd be plants. The brown algae are most of the time brown, but sometimes they can be green as well. And the brown algae have 2 things that are kind of like plants. They have holdfasts, which are like roots, and they have air bladders. So in the leaves and in the stems, they have little bubbles filled with air, and that keeps them afloat on top of the water because that's the way they're able to photosynthesize. Now, they also produce a substance called algin. It's a gooey, sticky, gummy substance, and you can actually use it to make gummy bears and other gummy things. One time I bought a make-your-own gummy bear kit, and it was this sprig of dried up brown algae, and I put it in some water and boiled it, and this gooey stuff started coming out of it, And then I added lots of sugar and lots of flavoring, and it tasted really good, even though it just came out of this little protist, this little brown algae plant. Finally, the colored algae, we have red algae, and red algae can live up to 200 meters deep in the ocean. And the reason is because of their special red pigment. The special red pigment captures dim light. So basically, they don't need bright light like plants do or like the green and the brown algae. They can capture the dim light that's way down at the bottom of the ocean, and they can still survive there. On the surface, they're almost green. As they get deeper, they're more red, and when they're at the bottom, they're so red they almost can look black because they have so much red pigment inside of them. So those are the 6 groups. Here are just a few more pictures of the diatoms, dinoflagellates, and euglena, and then a few more pictures of the green, brown, and red algae. So again, algae, those are the plant-like protists. They're like plants, but they're not plants because they do not have a nucleus if they're many-celled, and they do have a nucleus, but they're only single-celled if they are in the other group of the plant-like protists. So the second group are the animal-like protists, the protozoa. Proto means first, zoa means animal, not zoo, like some of you thought, but protozoa, the first animal. They're consumers. They eat their food, they have the ability to move, and all of the protozoa are single-celled. Now, you might notice, if you remember back to the bacteria video, it was the consumer ones, the ones that eat, that caused us problems and gave us disease, and sometimes these single-celled protozoa also can cause some diseases. So let's start off with the sarcodines. The sarcodines, up in the upper middle, they move by something called pseudopods. Basically, it's a bunch of cytoplasm from the cell that oozes out like jello, and then they grab on and pull the rest of their cytoplasmic mass along and move themselves with those pseudopods. They also can use the pseudopods to trap food, as you can see in the picture. They can cause something called amoebic dysentery, which is not a very nice stomach disease. It's like a stomach ache. It causes diarrhea, causes lots of bad issues. You don't want to get it. The second one is the second group are something called flagellates. Flagellates, if you've ever heard the word flagella before, flagellates move with flagella, and they cause something that's called the African sleeping sickness. They can also live inside termites and help them digest wood. They do some other helpful things and some harmful things. But African sleeping sickness is a disease that's caused by the tsetse fly. The flagellate lives in the tsetse fly, and when the tsetse fly bites you, the flagellates can go into your body and into your bloodstream and can cause the African sleeping sickness, where you get very sleepy and eventually you fall asleep forever. The ciliates move by cilia. Cilia are tiny little hair-like things that are all the way around the ciliate, and you can see them in the picture. Sometimes this paramecium is also known as the lady's slipper, and they use those cilia to move. They also use those cilia to channel the food into their oral groove to eat. The last group is called the sporozoa. Sporo meaning spore-producing, zoa meaning animal. So they're a spore-producing animal? No, they're a protist. But they are one group of protozoa that do not have the ability to move. And one of the reasons is all of the sporozoa are parasites. One example is the sporozoa that causes malaria. If you would live inside of your food and have all of your needs provided, would you go anywhere? Who knows? Maybe you wouldn't. But sporozoa live in blood, and they basically eat out of that. So there's no need for them to actually move any place. But they're still animal-like because they do eat their food. So here are a few more pictures of the ciliates, flagellates, and sporozoa sarcodines. Again, protozoa is a single-celled, animal-like protist. Now here's just an interesting size comparison that I like. If bacteria were the size of a soccer ball, a protozoa, the animal-like protist, would be comparable to the size of a soccer field. They're both single-celled, but the protozoa is a slightly larger single cell than the bacteria is. So 3 different ways that the protozoa move. We've talked about the cilia. Those are the short thread-like structures that they use for movement and also for channeling food. There are the pseudopods, which are temporary foot-like extensions that allow them to move as well as trap food. Do you notice their movement and the way they get their food are both the same? And then we already talked about before the flagella, the things that the bacteria have. So the third group of protists are the fungus-like protists, and the reason they're fungus-like is because they're consumers, and they usually are also saprophytes or decomposers. At some point in their life, they usually move, whether it's oozing, whether it's spores flying through the air, some way of getting from one place to another, and that's their reproduction as well. It's reproducing with spores. And you can see a few examples. The downy mildew, the slime molds, and the water molds are some examples of the fungus-like protists. They look like fungus, they act somewhat like fungus, but they're not fungus. They're protists that act like fungus. So just a big chart that shows the different groups, not including the fungus-like protists, to give you an idea about them. You can look at this on your own if you need more information. It tells you how they're helpful, harmful, what's unique about them, how they get their food, whether they move or not, how they move, how many cells they have. The only thing to watch out for in the helpful, harmful column, it does not tell you which is helpful and which is harmful. That's for you to figure out yourself. Here's some vocabulary. And finally, for this one, there are 2 sets of questions. There are 6 questions that you need to list the answers, and then there are 10 questions where you need to match the protist with its description. So that's just a little bit about protists. I bet it's one of those things that not many people know about, but we still learn about it in 7th grade life science. So stay tuned for the next episode, which is about a fungi.